Welcome to my talk, everyone. My name is Roy Pleasance. I'm from Cary, North Carolina, in the U.S. The title of my talk is User Life of Inhalers, essentially implications for patient care. I would like to thank the DDL conference as well as Dr. Usmani for inviting me to be here today. Let's just waiting for the slide to change. Okay, so let's first start defining inhaler shelf life and user life. So shelf life is referred to as in-package robustness. It's essentially the time interval from manufacture date to expiry date based on when potency is no longer guaranteed by the manufacturer. That is, it drops down as low as 80 to 85% of the prescribed dose. This is reported on both the inhaler and the packaging. User life is referred to as out-of-package robustness. It's the time interval from when the patient removes the inhaler from packaging until the manufacturer can no longer guarantee potency. And it is essentially only sorry, I'm a bit challenged with the advancer here. It is only reported on the patient leaflet. So this is typically what patients see on their inhaler. They see the shelf life expiration. Now, there are some inhalers, such as the elliptic device, that the patient can see the shelf life expiration put on there by the manufacturer, but also there's a place for the patient to write down when they first took it out of the package on the inhaler, as well as a discard date. Now, this particular inhaler that's widely used in Europe is a dry powder inhaler, somewhat of a short user life, but in any event, the manufacturer recommends that the patient write down the discard date of the inhaler on their personal calendar. So how are inhaler shelf life and user life determined? They're essentially experiments completed by manufacturers based on regulatory guidance. And these experiments are done in different conditions over time. Usually, the user life is done for at least 3 months. These experiments are done under recommended conditions. Um, uh, um, Such as room temperature and typically relative humidity around 40%. There are experiments also done in extreme storage conditions, high humidity, as well as high temperatures, typically humidity somewhere around 75% or greater. So where do we find aerosol performance data for inhaled medications, specifically the user life and shelf life? The basic information on inhaler storage and expiry is in the package insert and in the patient leaflet. Beyond this information there, actually the data on inhaler user life is fairly limited. There's some studies in peer-reviewed journals, and most of these studies are actually done by competitors. The details on most of aerosol performance data is considered proprietary by manufacturers. Now, of course, the manufacturers submit this data to regulatory agencies for initial approval, and then quite honestly, a lot of that detailed data is removed from public access, and so we don't have a lot of information out here in the public, so to speak. For example, we don't know what portion of drug is left at the end of user life for inhalers, and quite honestly, I think that would be a very useful clinical tool. So from a patient's perspective, essentially most patients are going to rely on shelf life expiry shown on the inhaler. And 2/3 of patients have no knowledge of their inhaler's user life. And it's not uncommon for patients to have multiples of the same inhaler, so certainly user life can come into play there. And the patients may not be able to differentiate a lack of response because of disease or if something's wrong with the inhaler, particularly if they don't realize that there's a user life there. And of course, socioeconomics and non-adherence increase the likelihood of inhaler compromise. We know that the poorest are inclined to more disease and are apt to store inhalers improperly because of relatively poor living conditions. And of course, non-adherence exposes inhalers to environment over a longer time period. Of course, we know there's around 50% non-compliance in asthma and COPD patients with their inhalers. From the healthcare provider perspective, just in general, Beginning with training, physicians and other healthcare providers receive very little education on inhalers and aerosol drug delivery, and that even includes specialists. It's quite weak, in my opinion. And of course, details like inhaler user life are even more remote to their thinking. From a clinical perspective, at the end of inhaler user life, aerosolized drug potency is usually not dramatically lower. You would expect some clinical response, at least for a while. But of course, this depends on the storage conditions and the product and formulation characteristics as far as its stability. But it also depends in terms of how that patient responds on the dose response for that patient, that drug, and in that inhaler at that point in time. And we do know that bronchodilator response curve shifts to the right with exacerbations. So, what affects inhaler shelf life and user life? Some of the main things are what packaging it originally comes in, the drug, the formulation, the time of storage, as well as the storage environment. Time is an important factor among these, as all inhalers will eventually lose potency and aerosol delivery robustness. Temperature is also important in that, all these inhalers pretty much are recommended storage at room temperature somewhere around 20 to 25 degrees centigrade. They do allow brief excursions. Environmental humidity is probably the biggest factor influencing shelf life and user life, in my opinion, because moisture is going to ingress into DPIs as well as MDIs and affect medication stability and aerosol delivery. And we know that about a third of patients keep their inhalers in the bathroom. So this is a typical medicine cabinet, and we're going to label that as the no inhaler medicine cabinet, hopefully here forward. Now, one thing that I think also affects user life, quite honestly, is marketing. And I know of examples of that. Okay, so now let's pay attention to metereddose inhalers and environmental humidity. What we do know is that water can ingress across gaskets on the MDI. And if you look over to the right on that figure, hopefully you can see at the top there's a diaphragm gasket, and then on the sides these are O-ring gaskets, and moisture will penetrate through those over time. HFA propellants are many more times susceptible to water than the old CFCs. For MDI solutions, these are essentially drugs solubilized in a liquid propellant with the aid of co-solvents, most often ethanol. And we know ethanol loves water. What moisture can do is induce chemical degradation or crystallization. For MDI suspensions, the particles are dispersed throughout the liquid propellant with the aid, most often with a surfactant. And moisture can affect agglomeration of that powder, particle growth, as well as phase separation. So a lot of people aren't aware that MDIs are susceptible to environmental humidity. So here's a study looking at MDI at different relative humidities and temperatures. So if you look at those top two curves, you see pretty high humidities, greater, I think 83 and 97%. I can't quite see it on my screen, but quite high humidities. So now if you go down to the bottom of those two curves, you really see starting early on, I would say within weeks, that high humidity is going to ingress into this MDI. But even if you look at the lower, more, we'll say, typical room humidities, probably we're all in now, you'll see that, oh yeah, moisture does get in there over time, but it just takes longer. So DPIs and environmental humidity, moisture ingress occurs for some, and I would say most DPIs under certain storage conditions. Essentially what happens, amorphous particles or amorphous regions on the crystalline particles are unstable and they tend to recrystallize at increased humidity because water acts as a plasticizer. The changes in the solid state property of DPIs during storage can significantly impact particle size, morphology, dissolution, and aerosol performance of the DPI formulation. So this is not exactly what we use in asthma COPD, but I think this pictures are quite representative. So this is superflux and inhaled powder, put in an open tray in settings with different environments. On the left picture there, you see 20% humidity. The middle, I think, is 55% humidity. And then the right is 75% humidity for 24 hours. And you see at that 75% humidity, you see how those particles conglomerate. And of course, that's going to decrease your fine particle fraction and fine particle delivery. Now, here's some representative inhalers in Europe and the US. So let's start with the Foster DPI and the Foster MDI. So they're the same drugs. But what you'll see there on the right under user life for the Foster, you'll see that the user life is actually shorter for the MDI than the DPI. So this would suggest that it's less stable to the environment. But quite honestly, we can't get to the detail of that data. So that is an assumption. So now let's turn our attention to some of the budesonide formoterol products in the U.S. And Europe. So if you look at the turbohaler, which is available pretty much everywhere outside the U.S. As far as Semicort is concerned, but you'll see that the user life is essentially the same 3 years as the shelf life. So this would suggest that this is very stable to environmental humidity or other environmental conditions. But then if you look at the Semicort in the US, it's an MDI and it's got a user life of 3 months. And quite honestly, that really puts us in a quandary when we try to apply this smart therapy in the US population. If that patient only uses 1 or 2 canisters of Semicort in a year, that means they're going to have to buy 4 of them rather than 1 or 2 if we adhere to the user life of 3 months for the Semicort. The Spiramax in Europe has sort of an intermediate user life. So in the US, this is how Semicort is packaged. It comes in a box, and this box is a foil pack. Inside the foil pack is a desiccant and the inhaler. So this would suggest that the MDI is quite susceptible to moisture, but the reality is we don't really know because we cannot get to that data. So now let's turn our attention, excuse me, I'll go back, turn our attention to the Accuhaler and the discus. So if you look on the far right, the user life in pretty much everywhere outside the US for the Accuhaler is 2 years and it's the same as a shelf life. But you come to the US, you'll see that the discus only has a 6-week user life and a 2-year user life. Then if you go down to the Fusicome, it's sort of similar to the discus in the US. Now let's just sort of look at the Ellipta, widely used inhaler across the world, but essentially it's got a 6-week user life and then a roughly around a 1.5 to 2 year shelf life. But when a patient gets the Ellipta, it comes in a box. Inside that box is a packet. Inside that packet is a desiccant, the inhaler, and then a seal on the top. And then when the patient removes that, then it becomes exposed to the moisture. And if you look inside a discus, excuse me, an Ellipta inhaler, you see those 2 blister rolls there, which is actually quite similar to the blister strips in the discus. And then just looking at a capsule dry powder inhaler, the user life and shelf life are essentially the same, but that's a little bit on how you define the user life. The user life, you just take those 10 capsules out of there is 2 years, but actually if you define user life when they take the capsule out of there is 30 minutes because moisture gets into that capsule quite rapidly. Okay. You also need to know that storing and packaging differs among countries. So in the US, this is how Advair comes in the discus. It's in a box in a foil sealed pack. The manufacturer recommends not starting to use it, not taking it out of the package until immediately before use. In all other countries across the world, you'll see that the discus comes in a box and they take the actual inhaler out of the box. So there is no desiccant. So let's drill down a little bit more on this because I think it has implications for patient use. So here's a study done by a competitor published in 2005. So this is comparing the turbohaler to the Accuhaler, out of the box, so to speak, over 3 months at different humidities and different temperatures. And they looked at the delivered dose as well as the fine particle dose. So at start, these drugs behave pretty much like you would expect based on the fine particle doses and delivered doses for both products. And then when you get to normal storage over 3 months, they look pretty stable. the next row down, although maybe a little bit drop in the fine particle dose for the serotype discus. But when you get to those higher humidities, higher temperatures, what you see is there's very little change in the fine particle and delivered dose for the Symbicort, but there's a quite dramatic change in the fine particle dose for the discus. And so that would suggest that you would have decreased lung delivery. But also notable is the delivered dose didn't drop. So that means you're going to have higher oropharyngeal deposition when you have a compromise in this inhaler's robustness. So in this same study, they took well-stored serotype and poorly stored serotype, as they represented in the prior slide. I believe this was 30 normal volunteers, where it was a crossover randomized study. And what you can see is the blood levels of fluticasone, which are going to be a pretty good estimate of lung delivery, are much higher when the serotype is administered to these patients when it's stored properly. Here's a study with the Easyhaler in high humidity, a widely used inhaler in Europe. So on the left there, you see delivered dose of budesonide and formoterol at different temperatures, different strengths, and it looks like the delivered dose remains pretty stable under those conditions for 48 to 96 hours. And if you look on the right with the fine particle dose, it looks pretty stable, although there was perhaps a drop in the budesonide at about 48 to 96 hours. And so in this article, the manufacturer says that this is an airtight reservoir containing the inhaler's formulation that protects the product from moisture such that dose delivery is unaffected by adverse storage conditions. So now let's look at a couple other studies with the Easyhaler. On the left, you'll see a study, an in vitro study, looking at high humidity with the Easyhaler and some other inhalers done by a competitor. On the right, you see a Novalizer versus Easyhaler done by independent researchers in high humidity. And what you see is on the left, with the Easyhaler, that bottom line there, it actually drops quite significantly in 45 days below that 80% accepted amount. And then on the right, they actually looked at this over a shorter time interval more regularly. And what they say is even at 2 weeks, you see substantial drops in the delivered dose and fine particle dose with the Easyhaler. So let's just talk about the humidity that we live in. So if you look at Dublin, Ireland, where I'm supposed to be right now, drinking a beer and enjoying wonderful Ireland, you see the humidity is quite high outside, with the lowest humidity in the summer months, highest humidity in the winter months. And if you go where Singapore, where Dr. Price is probably at, he's probably sweating as we speak, his humidity is pretty much over 80%. At all times. But if you look at where I'm at, our summer months are the most humid. So you can imagine a poor person that doesn't have a climatized house, they're going to be exposed to high humidity all the time. So in summary, MDIs are generally stable until user life and shelf life expiry if stored properly. If MDIs or DPIs are exposed to hot or humid conditions, particularly humid, both medication and aerosol performance can be compromised. And I believe both medication efficacy and safety are at risk. Patients and healthcare providers are poorly informed about user life and typically rely on the shelf life on the inhaler. And I bet if you asked all of us in this room, so to speak, to raise your hand what you use for your expiration on your inhaler, I bet you would raise your hand for shelf life. So we don't, a lot of patients use and store their inhalers in compromised environmental conditions, but we don't really know how often this truly occurs. I believe a patient-centered approach requires much greater transparency by pharmaceutical industry on inhaler performance characteristics. I do not believe it is in the best interest of patients nor providers that this information is proprietary. So now let's get to the meat of the matter. I think this little commercial will really.
It certainly is a big bun.
It's a very big bun.
Big fluffy bun.
It's a very big fluffy bun.
Where's the beef?
Some hamburger places give you a lot less beef on a lot of bun.
Where's the beef?
At Wendy's, we serve a hamburger we modestly call a single. And Wendy's single has more beef than the Whopper or Big Mac. At Wendy's, you get more beef and less bun.
Hey, where's the beef? I don't think there's anybody back there.
You want something better. You're Wendy's kind of people.
In any event, that's the end of the presentation. And I think this commercial, however how appropriate or inappropriate, I think really makes the point. And I could actually probably have some comment on the impact of that commercial across the U.S., but I won't. So thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully I got your attention, and hopefully some regulatory agents on this user life thing. We really need much greater transparency to have a patient-centered approach with inhaled therapies. Thank you.
Many thanks, Roy. I think you've raised some really important points there, and you've given this topic a bit of visibility. And interestingly, you've also set up some of our flash presentations for after the lunch break, which are actually addressing some of the things that you raised there. But I'll hand over to my co-chair, Gary, who's going to start with a few questions.
Sure. Thank you, Roy. Great presentation. One of the questions that we received is talking about the new propellants. As you know, the industry is now engaged in thinking about transitioning over to more environmentally friendly propellants. Do you think that those could sort of greater stability challenges compared to the?
Well, I haven't, I'm aware of these new propellants and the desire to make them more environmental friendly. I don't know the detail of that, but I would have a big question mark in terms of the stability. We know when we went from CFCs to HFAs, I think we did lose some stability. The 134As, we did lose some stability because of water. So it is an important question, and quite honestly, that the manufacturers need to step up and have some transparency on this stuff to give us the best information we can have so we can make the best decisions for our patients.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, so if we think about the meat, the user data that you've highlighted as being poorly available, if it were more available, how do you think that could be used to sort of inform this area? And is your suspicion that the regulations are too lax in this area, that the actual user life that are available are not appropriate?
Yeah. So to me, probably one of the biggest questions is at the end of user life, how much drug is left? Is it 81% or is it 99%? Because as I say, I think sometimes marketing drives these user lives. So is it marketing driving what the reported user life is, or the stability? So the data on what amount of drug is done, what sort of experiments publish these experiments, because there's not necessarily consistent regulation across the world. And really this just sort of represents one aspect of aerosol drug delivery. You could pick many other aspects of aerosol delivery. Some manufacturers don't even give the MMAD. Some manufacturers hide information about shaking or not shaking the inhalers. And it's just one piece of the, us not having data that can benefit our patients. And also, you can't solve a problem unless you know a problem. So I think patients probably need to be better informed about user life, such as strategies that the Ellipta uses, where the patient can write that on there, because patients are poorly informed, and the healthcare providers are poorly informed, so they don't even know to tell the patients, quite honestly. So I just think the patients need to know this. So if their inhaler's not working, well, it's old, so maybe I need to get a new inhaler, that sort of thing.
Right, there's been a question, I guess it's part question, part comment, saying that there's no about a minimum in-use shelf life. And I guess the question then is really, do you think there should be? Because given these in-use shelf lives are than the shelf life of the product, what's the relevance of the shelf life of the product? Do you think something should change here?
How would you deal? I'm not quite sure where to go with that question in terms of how you would change shelf life. I mean, I think it needs to be on the inhaler what the user life is, and maybe on the inhaler you have the expiration, and right under that expiration it should be stamped on there, discard after 45 days after package removal, right under the shelf life. I mean, I'm not sure you need to change actually what the shelf life is, but I think maybe better representation on the inhaler, what user life should be. That's the best way I know how to answer that question. Maybe it's more, maybe your question is more sophisticated than I'm able to answer.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. Ben, sorry, any
Yeah,
further questions?
Another question is, are you aware of any data where the humidity and the temperatures actually experienced by these devices has been measured in sort of real world studies?
No, I'm not aware of that, and I think that would be very useful. I've thought about doing a study where patients have a device to measure their humidity, where they keep the inhaler. That'd be a simple way of, at least knowing what humidity is exposed to. But it's not real world. I'm just sort of give you a really quick, brief thing. This pulmonary office in Miami, Florida, lost their electricity for about 4 days, and their adverse samples in their cabinets, when they give them out to patients, the patients came back and said these things didn't work. And that's probably the most real world thing I've got. And if you look at some real world studies by David Price, it looks like the powder works less well than the MDI, but it's hard to sort out, with the discus. Is it because it's dry powder inhaler and particle size, or was humidity a factor there? So there's some real world studies suggesting that maybe humidity comes into play there. For example, the turbohaler appeared to work better than the discus over time, and it's less susceptible to environmental moisture.
I think in the interest of time, Ben, we can probably stop there and move on.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. Excellent talk.